The wind on the surface of the planet Earth did not howl so much as it sighed. It was a thin, dry sound that carried the dust of 5,000 years across the rusted plains of the Northern Hemisphere. Xylus adjusted the filters on his breathing apparatus, feeling the slight vibration of the mechanical seals against his throat. He looked down at the sensor display embedded in his forearm sleeve. The reading was steady. They were standing directly above the primary seal of the structure that the records called the Seed of Silence. His companion, a younger researcher named Kalo, was busy clearing away the calcified remains of a concrete pylon. Kalo was from the inner moons, where the air was thick and the history was short. He did not possess the same reverence for the dead that Xylus had cultivated over 3 decades of sifting through the wreckage of fallen empires. This site was different from the libraries of the Centauri system or the sunken shipyards of the Orion Belt. This was the origin. This was the place where the species that had once terrified and then saved the galaxy had finally decided to stop existing. Kylo straightened his back and wiped a smudge of orange grit from his visor. He pointed a gloved finger at a heavy slab of dull metal that lay flush with the ground. It was not steel or titanium. It was a dense, non-reflective composite that seemed to swallow the dim light of the dying sun. Xylus knelt beside it and brushed away the last layer of silt. There was no keyhole. There was no digital interface. There was only a single indentation in the shape of a flat, 5-fingered hand. It was a primitive lock for a species that had mastered the art of folding space and time. Xylus felt a tremor of anticipation. For 2 centuries, the Galactic Archaeological Council had debated the purpose of this final vault. Some believed it contained the ultimate weapon that the humans had hidden away before their disappearance. Others thought it was a mass grave. Xylus had his own theory, though he had never voiced it aloud for fear of sounding like a dreamer. He believed it was a letter. He signaled to the heavy lifting drones hovering 20 feet above them. The machines descended with a low hum, their magnetic grapples locking onto the edges of the slab. Xylus stepped back, watching the tension in the cables. The ground groaned. A deep, resonant vibration shook the soles of his boots. A sound that felt like the planet itself was complaining about being woken up. With a sharp crack that echoed across the empty valley, the seal broke. The drones pulled the slab upward, revealing a dark, vertical shaft that descended into the bedrock. There was no rush of stale air or toxic gas. Instead, a soft, warm breeze drifted up from the depths. It smelled of damp earth and something sweet, like crushed lavender. It was a scent that had not existed on the surface of this world for millennia. Kalo leaned over the edge, his external lights cutting a bright path into the gloom. He whispered that the shaft appeared to be lined with organic material. Xylus nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He checked the radiation levels one last time, and then began the descent. The walls of the shaft were indeed covered in a thick, bioluminescent moss that pulsed with a faint green light. As they moved deeper, the temperature rose to a comfortable level. The rough stone gave way to smooth, white ceramic panels that looked as though they had been cleaned yesterday. At the bottom of the shaft, they found a corridor that stretched for several hundred yards. It was not a military bunker. The architecture was open and inviting, with arched ceilings and alcoves that held small, clay sculptures of animals and people. Xylus stopped to examine a figure of a small child holding a wooden stick. The craftsmanship was simple, almost crude, but the expression on the face was one of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a stark contrast to the monuments of war and technological dominance that characterized the later human era. He wondered why they had chosen to preserve these humble things here, at the very end of their story. They reached a set of double doors made of polished oak wood. Kylo hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He asked Xylus if they should wait for the security team to arrive. Xylus shook his head. He told the younger man that the humans would not have invited them in just to kill them. He pushed the doors open. Beyond lay a room that defied every expectation of the archaeological community. It was a garden. A vast, underground biodome filled with trees, flowers, and a small, trickling stream. Artificial sunlight beamed down from a series of crystalline mirrors in the ceiling, creating a perfect afternoon glow. In the center of the garden sat a simple wooden bench. And on that bench sat a figure. Xylus felt his breath catch. It was a human. He looked exactly like the holographic records, with grey hair and a lined face that suggested a great deal of laughter and a fair amount of sorrow. The figure did not move as they approached. It was only when they were within 10 feet that Xylus realized it was a sophisticated android, its skin so realistic that it even possessed a faint pulse. The android turned its head and looked at them. Its eyes were a deep, clear blue. It did not stand up or assume a defensive posture. It simply smiled and gestured to the empty space on the bench. It spoke in a voice that was warm and resonant, using a dialect of galactic standard that was perfectly clear despite its age. It welcomed them to the House of Memory. It said that it had been waiting for a very long time for someone to find the key. Kalo was trembling, his scanner forgotten in his hand. He asked the android if it was a guardian. The machine laughed softly and said that it was more of a librarian. It explained that its name was Elias and that it had been programmed to deliver a message to whoever was curious enough to dig through the dust. Xylus sat down on the edge of the bench, feeling the rough texture of the wood beneath his gloves. He asked the question that had haunted his profession for generations. He asked where the humans had gone. Elias looked up at the artificial sun and sighed. He said that they had not gone anywhere in the sense that the galaxy understood. They had not moved to another dimension or ascended to a higher plane of existence. They had simply realized that they were tired. They had spent 10,000 years fighting, building, and expanding until there was nothing left to conquer but their own nature. He explained that the humans had looked at the younger races, like the people of Xylus and Kalo, and realized that their presence was stifling the growth of the galaxy. They were the old giants who took up too much sun and left no room for the smaller trees to grow. So, they had made a choice. They had dismantled their fleets, archived their knowledge, and walked into the quiet places of the world to let the next generation take the lead. Xylus felt a lump in his throat. It was a level of humility that was almost impossible to comprehend for a species that had once held the stars in their hands. Kalo asked if this vault was a library of their technology. Elias shook his head. He said that the technology was gone, recycled into the earth or sent into the sun. This vault contained something much more valuable. He stood up and walked toward a small pedestal near the stream. On it sat a single silver disc. He picked it up and held it out to Xylus. He said that this was the record of their mistakes. He explained that the humans did not want the galaxy to remember them for their ships or their weapons. They wanted the galaxy to know how they had failed, how they had hurt each other, and how they had eventually learned to forgive. He told them that true strength was not found in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to be vulnerable. Xylus took the disc, feeling its weight. It was light, almost nothing. Yet it contained the weight of an entire civilization. As they spoke, a small bird fluttered down from a nearby tree and landed on the shoulder of the android. It chirped a bright, melodic song. Elias reached up and gently stroked its feathers with a finger. He said that the humans had spent their final years tending to this garden, ensuring that life would continue even after they were gone. They had wanted to leave behind a place of peace. Kalo looked around at the lush greenery and the clear water, his eyes wide with wonder. He admitted that he had expected gold or ancient machines. He had not expected a park. Elias smiled and said that the most precious thing a person could leave behind was a quiet room for a friend. He then invited them to stay for a while and listen to the stories. He said he had 1,000,000,000 tales of human folly and human grace, and he had plenty of time to tell them. Xylus looked at the disc in his hand, and then at the old android. He realized that the mystery of the vault was not about what was hidden inside, but why it had been closed in the first place. The humans had not been hiding their treasures, they had been protecting a sanctuary. They had known that one day the galaxy would grow loud and crowded again, and someone would need a place to sit and remember what it meant to be small. He deactivated his breathing apparatus, trusting the air of the vault. It was cool and sweet. He leaned back against the wooden bench and watched the light flicker through the leaves. For the first time in his long career, he did not feel like an archaeologist looking at the past. He felt like a guest who had arrived exactly when he was supposed to. He told Elias that they were ready to listen. The android began to speak of a city called New York, and a girl who had once planted a flower in a crack in the sidewalk. He spoke of wars that were ended not by treaties, but by 2 soldiers sharing a meal in the rain. He spoke of the time humanity had first looked at the stars and felt a sense of loneliness that could only be cured by kindness. As the hours passed, the tension that had gripped Xylus for years began to melt away. He understood now that the strength of humanity was not in their reach, but in their grasp of the things that truly mattered. They had left the galaxy not out of weakness, but out of a profound, sacrificial love for the future. They had cleared the path so that others could walk it. Kylo sat on the grass, his cynical edges softening with every word. He asked Elias if there were other vaults like this one. The android nodded and said there were thousands, scattered across the dead worlds of the old empire. Each one held a different part of the human soul. Some held their music, some held their art, and some held nothing but the sound of the ocean. He said that it was the task of the new races to find them and learn from them. The humans had left a map, not of the stars, but of the heart. Xylus realized that his work was only beginning. He was no longer just a collector of bones, he was a messenger. He looked at the silver disc and saw his own reflection in its polished surface. He looked older, tired, but for the first time, he looked hopeful. The artificial sun began to dim, simulating the approach of evening. The birds settled into the trees, and the stream seemed to quiet its chatter. Elias told them that it was time for them to return to the surface. He said that the world outside was waiting for the news they carried. He promised that he would be here whenever they needed to return. He stood by the wooden doors as they walked back toward the shaft. Xylus turned one last time to look at the garden. It was a small, fragile bubble of life in a vast, empty world. It was a testament to the fact that even at the end of all things, humanity had chosen to plant a garden. It was the most human thing they could have done. As they ascended the shaft, the dry wind of the surface greeted them again. But it no longer sounded like a sigh. To Xylus, it sounded like a breath. A long and steady intake of air before a new song began. They reached the top and looked out over the rusted plains. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the landscape. Kylo looked at Xylus and asked what they should tell the council. Xylus gripped the silver disc tightly. He told the younger man that they would tell them the truth. They would tell them that the humans had not left behind a legacy of power. They had left behind a legacy of peace. They would tell the galaxy that the vault was open, and that the lessons were finally ready to be learned. They walked toward their ship, their footsteps light on the ancient earth, leaving the last sealed vault behind them as a door that would never be closed again. The silver disc felt cold through the fabric of the glove Xylus wore, yet it carried a weight that seemed to anchor him to the very core of the planet. He looked at Kylo, whose face was illuminated by the soft amber glow of the setting sun. The younger man was no longer scanning for mineral deposits or structural weaknesses. He was looking at the horizon, as if seeing the world for the first time. The silence that had once seemed oppressive and empty now felt pregnant with possibility. It was the silence of a house that was waiting for its occupants to return. Or perhaps the silence of a theatre after a magnificent performance had ended. Xylus reached up and pulled the seal of his mask away from his face. The air of Earth was thin and tasted of old iron and dry grass, but it was breathable. He took a long, slow draw of the atmosphere into his lungs. He wanted to feel the reality of the origin world, without the mediation of filters and synthetic membranes. He told Kalo that they should not wait for the transport ship to land. He wanted to walk across the surface for a few miles, to feel the vibration of the ground beneath his boots, and to process the magnitude of what the librarian had shared. Kalo nodded in agreement, his usual restlessness replaced by a quiet, contemplative stillness. They began to walk away from the shaft, leaving the seed of silence behind. The drones hovered above them, their red navigation lights blinking like distant stars. Xylus kept his fingers pressed against the silver disc. He thought about the stories Elias had promised to tell. He thought about the girl who had planted a flower in a crack in the sidewalk. It was a small image, yet it stood in stark contrast to the grand monuments of the Centauri system, or the massive orbital rings of the outer rim. The humans had reached the pinnacle of technological evolution, yet they had chosen to define themselves by their smallest acts of empathy. This was the secret they had hidden away. They had not been afraid of being forgotten. They had been afraid that their power would be the only thing remembered. As they crested a small ridge of orange sand, the ruins of an ancient city came into view. The skeletons of steel and glass reached toward the darkening sky, like the fingers of a buried giant. In the past, Xylus had seen these ruins as a testament to a fallen empire, a graveyard of ambition. Now he saw them as the discarded shells of a species that had simply outgrown its need for stone and metal. He realized that the humans had not vanished because they had failed. They had vanished because they had succeeded in the most difficult task of all. They had learned how to let go. They had stepped aside to allow the universe to breathe, to allow new voices to rise and find their own rhythm. Kylo stopped and pointed toward a small patch of green, growing near a rusted girder. It was a hardy shrub, its leaves thick and waxy. It was not a product of the biodome below, but a wild thing that had survived on the surface through sheer persistence. Xylus knelt beside it and touched a leaf. It was a sign that the planet was slowly healing itself, reclaiming the scars left by the ages of industry. He told Kylo that the humans had been right to trust the future. The galaxy was not a static museum to be preserved, but a living garden that required constant tending and the occasional pruning of the old to make way for the new. The communication device on the wrist of Xylus began to chime. It was the Archaeological Council, demanding a status update and a full inventory of the treasures found within the vault. Xylus looked at the blinking light and felt a momentary flash of irritation. They wanted gold. They wanted weapons. They wanted the keys to the kingdom of the stars. He opened the channel, but did not speak immediately. He looked at the silver disc and then at the vast open sky. He told the dispatcher that there were no weapons in the Seed of Silence. He told them that there was no gold and no lost technology. He said that they had found something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. He told them they had found a mirror. The voice on the other end of the line was confused, asking for clarification in a sharp, clinical tone. Xylus deactivated the link. He would explain it all in due time, but not through a radio frequency. This was a truth that needed to be carried by hand and spoken with the breath of a living person. He and Kalo continued their trek toward the landing zone. The stars were beginning to emerge, bright and cold in the clear air. For the first time in his life, Xylus did not feel small when he looked at the cosmos. He felt a sense of belonging. He understood that the humans were not gone in the way a flame is extinguished. They were gone in the way a seed disappears when it becomes a tree. They reached the landing pad where their ship waited, its sleek hull reflecting the starlight. The security team was already there, standing with their weapons drawn and their sensors active. They looked tense, expecting a threat to emerge from the darkness. Silas walked past them without a word, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the vessel. He climbed the ramp and entered the main cabin, followed closely by Kylo. The younger man sat down at his station and began to power up the engines, but his movements were slow and deliberate. He was no longer the hurried researcher who wanted to finish the job and return to the comfort of the inner moons. He was a witness. Xylus sat in the pilot chair and placed the silver disc on the console in front of him. He knew that the journey back to the central systems would be long and difficult. He knew that many people would be disappointed by what he brought back. There would be those who would call him a fool, and those who would try to take the disc by force, believing it held some hidden code for ultimate power. But he was not afraid. He had been given a gift that could not be stolen. He had been given the knowledge that the greatest act of strength was the act of making room for others. As the ship lifted off the ground, Xylus looked down through the observation port. The earth was a dark marble below them, shrouded in the shadows of the night. He could see the faint green glow of the moss from the shaft, a tiny spark of light in the vastness of the plains. He thought about Elias, the lonely librarian sitting on his wooden bench, waiting to tell his stories to whoever would listen. He promised himself that he would return. He would bring students, artists, and leaders. He would bring anyone who was tired of the noise of the galaxy and needed to hear the whisper of the wind. The ship broke the atmosphere and entered the silent void of space. Xylus turned his gaze forward, toward the distant clusters of stars, where billions of lives were currently struggling, dreaming, and fighting. He reached out and touched the console, his fingers grazing the edge of the silver disc. He told Kylo to set a course for the capital, but to take the long way back. He wanted to watch the stars for a while. He wanted to remember the girl and the flower, and the soldiers in the rain. He wanted to remember that they were all part of a single, long story that had no real beginning and no true end. The galaxy was wide and full of mysteries, but the greatest mystery of all had finally been solved. The humans had not abandoned their children. They had simply given them the keys to the house and told them to enjoy the morning. Xylus closed his eyes and listened to the hum of the ship. In his mind, he could still hear the song of the bird in the underground garden. It was a song of peace, a song of hope, and a song of home. The seed of silence had finally blossomed, and the harvest was just beginning. He was ready to tell the story. He was ready to lead the way into the quiet places of the heart. The mission was over, but the work of being alive had only just begun. The ancient world faded into the blackness behind them, a silent sentinel guarding the memories of the past, while the future burned bright and clear ahead.